The administrative structure of the Ming imperial court rested on an intricate hierarchy in which rank, proximity to the emperor, and ritualized conduct determined both privilege and vulnerability. Within this system, concubines occupied a defined yet precarious position. They were neither ordinary servants nor fully empowered members of the ruling household. Historical records indicate that their status was carefully codified, regulated through court statutes, and enforced through a disciplinary framework designed to maintain order within the inner palace. Surviving documents from the Ming period, particularly those relating to palace administration and legal codes, suggest that the emperor's consorts were organized into a strict ranking system. Titles such as imperial noble consort, and lower-ranked concubines reflected not only favor but also administrative classification. These distinctions carried material consequences, including access to resources, living quarters, and attendance. However, they also defined the degree of scrutiny and discipline applied to each individual. The Ming court operated under a broader legal philosophy derived from Confucian governance, which emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and moral conduct. Within this framework, the emperor was positioned as the ultimate patriarch, and the inner palace functioned as an extension of this authority. Legal codes of the period reveal that infractions within the palace were not treated as private matters, but as disruptions to imperial order. As a result, punishments administered to concubines were shaped less by personal grievance and more by the perceived need to preserve systemic stability. Contemporary accounts describe a network of palace officials, including eunuchs and female administrators, who were responsible for monitoring the behavior of concubines. These individuals reported directly to higher authorities within the court, ensuring that even minor deviations from prescribed conduct were documented. The presence of such oversight mechanisms indicates that discipline was institutional rather than arbitrary. It operated through established procedures, often recorded in palace memorials and internal reports. One of the most common categories of offense involved breaches of ritual propriety. The Ming court placed significant emphasis on ceremonial behavior, and concubines were expected to adhere to precise standards in dress, speech, and movement. Chroniclers noted that even small errors, such as improper greetings or failure to observe hierarchical etiquette, could result in formal reprimands. These punishments were not always severe, but they reinforced the expectation of constant vigilance. More serious infractions included attempts to gain influence outside prescribed channels. Historical records indicate that concubines were prohibited from engaging in political affairs or forming alliances that could disrupt the balance of power within the court. Any suspicion of manipulation, particularly if it involved eunuchs or external officials, was treated with heightened severity. In such cases, the punishment system extended beyond correction and into deterrence. Surviving documents suggest that punishments ranged from loss of privileges to physical penalties. Demotion within the concubine hierarchy was a common disciplinary measure. This could involve reassignment to less favorable living quarters, reduction in attendance, and decreased access to the emperor. Such actions effectively altered a concubine's position within the social structure of the palace, often with long-term consequences for her security and influence. In more severe cases, records describe the use of confinement. Concubines accused of significant misconduct could be placed under house arrest within designated palace areas. These spaces were monitored, limiting contact with others and restricting movement. Contemporary accounts indicate that confinement served both as punishment and as a means of preventing further disruption. It isolated the individual while signaling to others the consequences of noncompliance. Physical punishment, while less frequently documented in official records, is referenced in certain historical accounts. The Ming legal system permitted corporal punishment under specific circumstances, and this extended, in controlled forms, to the inner palace. However, the application of such measures appears to have been regulated, often requiring authorization from higher authorities. This suggests an attempt to balance disciplinary enforcement with the maintenance of imperial dignity. Execution, though rare, was not absent from the system. Historical records indicate that concubines implicated in severe offenses, such as treason or involvement in plots against the emperor, could face capital punishment. These cases were typically documented with caution, reflecting their gravity and the broader implications for court stability. Chroniclers noted that such actions were intended to reinforce the inviolability of imperial authority. The role of eunuchs within this system was particularly significant. As intermediaries between the emperor and the inner palace, they held considerable influence over the enforcement of discipline. Surviving documents suggest that eunuchs were often responsible for carrying out orders related to punishment, as well as for reporting infractions. Their position allowed them to shape the flow of information, which in turn affected how disciplinary decisions were made. At the same time, the presence of female officials within the palace added another layer of governance. These individuals, often experienced and trusted by the court, managed daily operations and ensured compliance with established rules. Historical records indicate that they played a key role in documenting behavior and implementing lesser punishments. Their involvement reflects the complexity of the administrative system, which relied on multiple channels of oversight. The punishment system also functioned as a mechanism of control beyond individual cases. By establishing clear consequences for specific actions, it reinforced the broader structure of the court. Surviving documents suggest that the visibility of punishment, whether through demotion, confinement, or other measures, served as a deterrent. It communicated the boundaries of acceptable behavior and underscored the authority of the emperor. At the same time, the system was not entirely rigid. Historical records indicate that the emperor retained discretion in disciplinary matters. This allowed for variations in enforcement, influenced by factors such as personal favor, political considerations, and the broader context of the court. In some cases, concubines who had fallen out of favor could regain status, while others faced lasting consequences for similar infractions. This variability highlights the interplay between formal rules and individual authority. The lived reality of concubines within this system was shaped by constant awareness of these dynamics. Contemporary accounts describe an environment in which adherence to protocol was essential for survival. The potential for punishment, combined with the hierarchical nature of the court, created conditions in which behavior was carefully regulated. This was not merely a matter of obedience, but of navigating a complex social and political landscape. Surviving documents suggest that the psychological impact of this system was significant. The combination of surveillance, competition, and the possibility of punishment contributed to an atmosphere of caution. Concubines were required to manage not only their relationship with the emperor, but also their interactions with others within the palace. This included forming alliances, avoiding conflicts, and maintaining a reputation for propriety. In this context, punishment functioned as both a corrective and a preventive tool. It addressed specific incidents while reinforcing the broader framework of control. Historical records indicate that the system was designed to sustain order within a confined and highly structured environment. The inner palace, though physically separated from the outer world, was deeply connected to the political stability of the empire. As a result, the disciplinary mechanisms applied to concubines cannot be understood solely as personal or domestic measures. They were integral to the governance of the Ming court, reflecting the values and priorities of the period. Legal codes, administrative records, and contemporary accounts collectively suggest a system in which punishment was embedded within the fabric of imperial authority, shaping both individual experiences and the functioning of the court as a whole. The structure and enforcement of this system reveal a broader pattern of governance in which control was maintained through a combination of codified rules, institutional oversight, and discretionary power. Within the walls of the imperial palace, these elements converge to create a disciplined environment where every action carried potential consequences, and where the boundaries of authority were continuously reinforced through the mechanisms of punishment. The enforcement of discipline within the Ming imperial court did not operate in isolation, but was closely tied to the broader bureaucratic culture that defined governance across the empire. Surviving documents suggest that the same principles applied in provincial administration, documentation, hierarchy, and procedural order were replicated within the inner palace, albeit in a more controlled and enclosed environment. This convergence of administrative logic and domestic governance created a system in which concubines were subject to oversight that was both personal and institutional. Historical records indicate that accusations against concubines were rarely acted upon without some form of verification. Reports submitted by eunuchs or palace attendants were often reviewed by senior officials within the inner court. These reviews could involve cross-checking testimonies, examining patterns of behavior, and in some cases, consulting with trusted advisors of the emperor. This process reflects an effort to maintain a degree of procedural legitimacy, even within a setting where ultimate authority rested with a single individual. At the same time, contemporary accounts describe how the closed nature of the palace limited transparency. Evidence was often confined to internal reports, and the individuals responsible for investigation were themselves part of the same hierarchical structure. This created conditions in which personal rivalries and factional alignments could influence outcomes. Chroniclers noted that concubines who lacked powerful allies were more vulnerable to accusations, while those with established favor or connections could sometimes avoid severe consequences. The role of documentation was central to this system. Surviving palace records suggest that infractions, punishments, and changes in rank were carefully recorded. These records served multiple purposes. They provided a reference for future decisions, reinforced accountability among officials, and contributed to the continuity of court administration. The existence of such documentation indicates that punishment was not merely reactive, but part of an ongoing administrative process. One of the more complex aspects of the punishment system involved the intersection of moral expectations and political considerations. The Ming court was deeply influenced by Confucian ideals, which emphasized virtues such as loyalty, humility, and obedience. Legal codes of the period reveal that these values were not abstract principles, but were embedded in regulations governing behavior within the palace. Concubines were expected to embody these virtues, and deviations were interpreted as both personal failings and potential threats to order. Historical records indicate that accusations of jealousy or rivalry among concubines were treated with particular seriousness. Such conflicts, while perhaps inevitable in a competitive environment, were seen as disruptive to the harmony of the inner court. Contemporary accounts describe instances in which disputes escalated into formal investigations, with participants facing punishment for actions deemed excessive or destabilizing. These cases illustrate how interpersonal dynamics could become matters of administrative concern. In more severe situations, allegations of poisoning or harm to rivals were documented in court records. While not all such accusations were substantiated, their mere possibility prompted strict enforcement measures. Surviving documents suggest that the court responded to these threats with heightened vigilance, including increased surveillance and more severe penalties. The emphasis on prevention reflects the high stakes associated with maintaining order within the imperial household. The punishment of concubines also intersected with issues of succession and lineage. The production of heirs was a central function of the imperial household, and any actions perceived to interfere with this process were treated with extreme caution. Historical records indicate that concubines who were suspected of harming potential heirs, whether through direct action or negligence, faced some of the most severe consequences within the system. These cases were often documented in detail, underscoring their significance. At the same time, the emperor's personal involvement in disciplinary matters introduced an element of unpredictability. Surviving accounts suggest that decisions could be influenced by factors beyond the formal evidence presented. Favor, emotional disposition, and broader political considerations all played a role in shaping outcomes. This dynamic highlights the tension between institutional procedures and the central authority of the emperor. The influence of eunuchs within this context remained a defining feature of the system. Historical records indicate that certain eunuchs accumulated significant power, particularly those who had close access to the emperor. Their ability to control information and execute orders placed them in a position where they could affect the enforcement of punishment. Contemporary accounts describe instances in which eunuchs acted as both enforcers and intermediaries, shaping how disciplinary measures were applied. At the same time, the court periodically attempted to regulate the influence of eunuchs. Legal codes and imperial edicts sought to define their roles and limit abuses of power. However, surviving documents suggest that these efforts were not always fully effective. The reliance on eunuchs as administrative agents within the palace created a structural dependency that was difficult to eliminate. This dependency, in turn, influenced how punishment systems functioned in practice. The daily life of concubines was shaped by this complex interplay of rules, oversight, and informal dynamics. Contemporary accounts describe routines that were tightly regulated, from scheduled audiences with the emperor to prescribed forms of conduct in communal spaces. Within this environment, the possibility of punishment was a constant presence. Even actions that might appear minor in another context could carry significant consequences within the palace. Surviving documents suggest that concubines developed strategies to navigate this environment. These included adherence to ritual, cultivation of alliances, and careful management of personal conduct. However, such strategies did not guarantee security. The hierarchical nature of the court meant that status could change rapidly, and the mechanisms of punishment could be applied with varying degrees of severity. The use of exile within the palace itself represents another dimension of the punishment system. Historical records indicate that concubines who fell out of favor could be relocated to more remote or less desirable sections of the palace complex. This form of internal exile reduced their visibility and influence while maintaining their presence within the controlled environment of the court. It served as both a disciplinary measure and a means of managing the social structure of the palace. In some cases, records describe the transfer of concubines to religious institutions or secondary residences. This practice, while less common, reflects an alternative approach to discipline that removed individuals from the immediate context of the court. Such actions were often framed as both punitive and corrective, aligning with broader cultural practices that associated withdrawal from court life with moral reflection. The long-term consequences of punishment within the Ming court were significant. Demotion or loss of favor could have lasting effects on a concubine's position, not only within the palace but also in relation to her family. Historical records indicate that the status of imperial consorts was closely tied to the fortunes of their relatives, and changes in rank could influence broader social and political networks. This interconnectedness underscores the wider impact of disciplinary decisions. At the same time, the system allowed for limited forms of rehabilitation. Surviving documents suggest that concubines who demonstrated sustained adherence to expected conduct could, in some cases, regain a measure of status. Such outcomes were not guaranteed and often depended on shifts in court dynamics, including changes in imperial favor. This possibility of restoration added another layer of complexity to the system, reinforcing the importance of ongoing compliance. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms was the creation of an environment in which control was maintained through a combination of surveillance, documentation, and hierarchical enforcement. Historical records indicate that the punishment system was not static, but evolved in response to the needs of the court. Adjustments to regulations, shifts in administrative practices, and changes in personnel all contributed to its development over time. Within this framework, the experiences of concubines were shaped by both the formal structures of governance and the informal realities of court life. Contemporary accounts suggest that the boundary between these domains was often fluid, with personal relationships and institutional rules intersecting in complex ways. The punishment system operated at this intersection, reflecting the broader dynamics of power within the Ming imperial court. As a result, the disciplinary practices applied to concubines can be understood as part of a larger strategy of governance. They were designed not only to address individual behavior, but also to reinforce the stability of the imperial household. Surviving documents and historical analyses collectively suggest that this system, while often rigid, was also adaptive, responding to the shifting conditions of court politics and imperial authority. Over time, the punishment system applied to concubines in the Ming imperial court became inseparable from the broader patterns of political instability and institutional strain that characterized the later decades of the dynasty. Historical records indicate that as central authority weakened in certain periods, the enforcement of discipline within the inner palace did not diminish, but, in some cases, intensified. This shift reflects the tendency of closed political systems to rely more heavily on internal regulation when external pressures increase. Surviving documents from the late Ming period suggest that the imperial court faced mounting challenges, including fiscal difficulties, factional disputes, and administrative corruption. Within this environment, the inner palace remained a focal point of symbolic and practical authority. The conduct of concubines, therefore, continued to be closely monitored, not only for reasons of personal discipline, but also for its perceived connection to the moral order of the state. Legal codes of the period reveal that the behavior of those closest to the emperor was often interpreted as a reflection of the health of imperial governance itself. Contemporary accounts describe how the increasing influence of court factions affected the application of punishment. Alliances between eunuchs, officials, and members of the inner palace could shape the outcomes of disciplinary cases. Chroniclers noted that accusations were sometimes entangled with broader political rivalries, making it difficult to separate individual misconduct from factional strategy. This development illustrates how the punishment system, while formally structured, could become a tool within larger struggles for influence. The role of documentation remained central during this period, but surviving records suggest that their reliability could be affected by the same dynamics. Reports might emphasize certain details while omitting others, depending on the interests of those involved in their compilation. This does not indicate a complete breakdown of administrative practice, but it does highlight the limitations of the system when subjected to internal pressures. The existence of conflicting accounts in some cases reflects the complexity of interpreting events within the court. Despite these challenges, the fundamental principles of the punishment system persisted. Hierarchy, ritual propriety, and obedience continued to define expectations for concubines. Historical records indicate that even during periods of instability, the court maintained its emphasis on these values. Punishments for breaches of conduct, whether minor or severe, were still framed within the established legal and moral framework of the dynasty. At the same time, the lived experiences of concubines during these later years appear to have been shaped by heightened uncertainty. Contemporary accounts suggest that shifts in imperial attention and changes in court personnel could alter the balance of power within the palace. In such conditions, the risk associated with accusations may have increased, as the protective networks that some individuals relied upon became less stable. This environment reinforced the importance of caution and adaptability in navigating daily life. Surviving documents also indicate that the symbolic function of punishment became more pronounced. Public or semi-public acts of discipline within the palace served to reaffirm authority at a time when it was being challenged in other areas of governance. Chroniclers noted that these actions were often carefully staged, emphasizing the continuity of imperial control. This suggests that punishment operated not only as a practical measure, but also as a form of political communication. The connection between the inner palace and the broader administrative system remained evident in the handling of severe cases. Allegations involving threats to the emperor or the imperial lineage continued to be treated with the highest level of scrutiny. Historical records indicate that such cases could involve consultation with senior officials outside the immediate palace structure, reflecting their significance. The integration of these processes underscores the extent to which the punishment of concubines was linked to the stability of the state. In examining the long-term effects of this system, it becomes clear that its impact extended beyond the individuals directly involved. The regulation of concubines contributed to the maintenance of a controlled environment within the palace, which in turn supported the functioning of the imperial court. Surviving documents suggest that this stability, however constrained, played a role in sustaining the continuity of governance over extended periods. At the same time, the system also imposed limitations on the agency of those within it. The strict enforcement of hierarchy and conduct reduced the scope for independent action, particularly among lower-ranked concubines. Historical records indicate that opportunities for advancement were closely tied to compliance with established norms, reinforcing the centrality of discipline in shaping individual trajectories. This dynamic reflects a broader pattern within hierarchical societies, where mobility is mediated by adherence to institutional expectations. The psychological dimensions of this system are more difficult to document, but contemporary accounts provide some insight. Chroniclers noted the importance of self-regulation and the constant awareness of surveillance within the palace. The potential for punishment, combined with the competitive nature of the environment, created conditions in which behavior was carefully managed. This suggests that the influence of the punishment system extended beyond formal enforcement, shaping attitudes and decision-making processes. In the final analysis, the punishment system used against concubines in the Ming imperial court can be understood as a multifaceted mechanism of governance. It combined legal codes, administrative procedures, and discretionary authority to maintain order within a highly structured environment. Historical records indicate that this system was both consistent in its underlying principles and adaptable in its application, responding to the changing conditions of the court. The persistence of these practices across different reigns highlights their perceived importance within the broader framework of imperial rule. Legal codes of the period reveal a sustained commitment to the regulation of behavior within the palace, reflecting the belief that order in the inner court was essential to the stability of the state. This perspective was reinforced by contemporary accounts, which frequently linked the conduct of imperial consorts to the moral authority of the emperor.